Well, welcome to ATGLive, your Thursday episode. I didn't mean to scare you, Scott, with the exploding Death Star at the end. It's a little bit of a
I had friends on there.
yes.
What?
Unfortunately, yeah, it's a bad way to let you know that the Death Star is gone. But yeah, so I'm your host, Pete Fletcher, one of your hosts. Usually I'm joined by Nick Milky, but Nick is busy this evening, but we are fortunate to be joined by our very special guest,
Thank
Scott
God.
Chernoff. Scott, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Pete?
Great. It's been a while since we've had a chance to talk. You've been on the show a bunch of times. You're kind of a regular at this point. We have a handful of
Kind
people
of.
who are regulars, and you
More
are
regular than Nick, apparently.
This is true.
I'm
This is
looking
true.
around like I'm in a Brady Bunch box and I don't see him.
There needs to be a third face, but it's not here right now. But I'm really glad you're here with us tonight. We're gonna go through some news. We're gonna talk a little bit about Star Wars and nostalgia. I'm sure we're gonna
I
hit
like
on
Star Wars.
You like Star Wars, do you?
Too. Yeah, I'm a fan.
You've been around the Star Wars world a bit in your life. Maybe just before we dig into it, just tell people a little bit about why you are qualified. What are your Star Wars qualifications?
No, I'm no more qualified than any other fan.
We're gatekeeping here right now.
I was also in the right place at the right time, and I knew how to write. So that word "write" is in there a lot. So yeah, I was the head writer and then managing editor for Star Wars Insider. So for the one or two people that are listening or watching who have never heard of that, it is, and I think most people in the world have not heard of it, but I think most people who follow you have.
Right. If somebody's watching a Star Wars podcast, there's a good chance
it is Lucasfilm's official Star Wars magazine, and I was there way like a million years ago. Back in the prior millennium, I started in the mid 90s,
right
back in what I call the Star Wars dark years, when nothing was going on except nerds like me writing about it. And then through the prequels, and I was there basically through the release of episode 2. And I occasionally would freelance after that. But yeah, so I did a lot of writing about and interviewing about Star Wars. I was also part of the first and second and fourth Star Wars Celebration. I was the moderator, do we call it? The host?
Yeah,
whatever
sure.
you want to call it, on stage B. Anthony Daniels had stage A at the very first Star Wars Celebration. So the more time goes on, the more I'm thinking that might be the headline of my Star Wars career.
Well, it's funny because you're right. I mean, Star Wars Celebration is, just today, some of the artwork from Star Wars Celebration Japan dropped just actually like moments before we came on. So that's it's an event now that is so much bigger than and I think it's because Star Wars is so much bigger, perhaps. But it's hard to say. I mean, and that's kind of one of the things we
Star
want to
Wars
talk.
is bigger than it was. I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard to say.
It's maybe just as big, except the difference is that there are fewer there were fewer other things.
Right.
When Star Wars was newer.
Right.
It was a much smaller universe of
the intensity was a little bit different as well, because it was just a different way to take in all of what Star Wars was, and I think that's what made Celebration 1, 2, and particularly 4 so much more special, because it was pre-internet. I mean, because I did have the opportunity to write one article for you at Star Wars Insider, and when I was at Star Wars Galaxy, that was where we got our Star Wars stuff. That was our internet. The only place. I mean, I was doing articles with Steve Sansweet with what we called sort of super fans, and the only way to find them, to find people like these brothers in Florida who built 6-foot Star Destroyers out of plywood, I wasn't finding that online because it didn't really exist. It was finding people through, conventions and just word of mouth, and so it was a different time. And so
the news, like, we were gearing up for the prequels, and we would have a prequel update in every issue, but we would publish like 2 months after something was written. And then StarWars.com started to come to life. And so in the early days of StarWars.com, there was this weird, almost, I don't know if I'd call it tension, but just like those of us at the magazine were just like, well, this is no longer the place for breaking news. We can't, we could have exclusives,
Right.
have exclusive pictures and exclusive news, but really the major news was not going to be broken in Star Wars Insider. And so there was a
Right.
bit of an identity crisis, I think, for a while. Like, what are we doing here? Why are we doing prequel updates for
Right.
people who are going to be getting everything off the internet now?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and now it's become kind of and it still exists today, and it's sort of an in-depth
Okay.
kind of collectible, and there's still value to holding a magazine in your hand and reading it and
Mhm.
collecting it that way. So that's great. Yeah. So we are going to talk a little bit about Star Wars and history and nostalgia and whatnot a little bit coming up in the show. But before we get going, I want to remind everybody, if you're watching at home or wherever I don't know, maybe you're on a bus, maybe you're on a train, maybe you downloaded the Wi-Fi on a plane on your way to visit some friends and family during the holidays. I don't know.
Let's think of
But
scenarios. Maybe
yes.
they're on the subway.
Okay. Yes.
Maybe they've traveled to another country and they don't have Wi-Fi, but they can get us on a cell connection.
Right. So they're paying roaming charges right
Yeah,
now and
there's all kinds.
enjoying the
Yeah,
show, and disappointed that Nick didn't join tonight. They were like,
aren't we all?
I'm paying
If one
48
of the
cents a
crowd
minute.
to drop out, I was hoping it wouldn't be Nick. Let's put it that way. Nothing personal though, Pete.
No, it's people know I'm going to be here no matter what. Make sure to follow us on all your social media networks at the SSW Network. We're trying to get off Twitter, but the reality is I'm still there. I don't know why I can't get away from it, but you can find us on Threads and Instagram, all at the SSW Network. And Scott,
Blue Sky. I'm on Blue Sky now.
yes, I've decided I'm going to call it Blue Ski. I think I think
I'll allow it.
But so you are at Scott Chernoff on Blue Sky and everything.
Whatever I'm on that. I'm at Scott Chernoff. I'm not really on Instagram, but
yeah,
who needs to see my picture anymore?
you can just tune in to ATG every 3 to 6 months, and they'll be able to see you, which is great. Which is excellent. Well, good. So make sure you like, subscribe, share, all that good stuff. We are we had a very kind of a quiet week in news this week, so I'm going to bring up some news stories. We're going to talk about them, have a little bit of fun with the news, and then we're gonna take a deep dive into some different thoughts about Star Wars. And Skeleton Crew, before we go, have you watched Skeleton Crew?
Yes.
Okay, good. That's very good, because we're gonna.
What do you think? Who do you think I am? What kind of monster do you think I am?
Well, I mean, if I was going to gatekeep somehow, I needed to know what your level of Star Wars was. So, but let's hit the news, shall we? All right. Well, that's our crazy news intro, and you like that?
I recognized most of the characters.
Okay, that's all you need. You don't need to know all of them. That's fine. We'll let you stick around.
Holding lit up things.
Well, it happened so fast, right?
Yeah,
so
it was very quick.
Well, our first story of the night is that the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art, which is an ambitious project with an estimated budget of about $1.5 billion, that's with a B, is set to open its doors to the public in 2026, located in Los Angeles Exposition Park. The museum has been under development for several years and now enters its final stages of completion. Co-founded by filmmaker George Lucas and business leader Melody Hobson, the museum is the first of its kind to focus exclusively on storytelling through visual mediums. Its collection will feature a diverse array of works, including painting, sculptures, photography, comic art, and filmmaking, representing cultures and styles from across the globe. This institution aims to explore how narrative art connects communities and influences societal perspectives. The Lucas Museum's 300,000 square foot building, designed by Ma Yasang of MAD Architects with Stantec as an executive architect, is complemented by an 11-acre campus featuring green spaces designed by Studio MLA. All these are words and names that I'm sure you and all of our listeners are very familiar with.
Studio MLA they do the best green spaces. They do. You're in good hands if you're in a green space by them.
I'm glad to hear you say because that's what I've been saying for years, and it's good to have somebody support that.
Yeah, I mean,
Vis-
everything else they suck at, but green space
right.
is great.
The blue spaces, maybe
No,
not.
not so hot.
Not so much. Visitors can expect expansive galleries, 2 state-of-the-art theaters, and areas dedicated to education, dining, retail, and events. As construction nears conclusion, the museum's opening will mark a significant addition to LA's cultural landscape and a new destination for fans of art, storytelling, and the work of George Lucas. Uh, Scott, what are your thoughts on this kind of a museum, and what kind of is it? It's a really kind of cool concept because it feels sort of like, we're used to traditional art museums, right? Where paintings and sculptures by the great works. We are kind of at a point where visual storytelling is one of the great ways to tell a story now.
That's a good point. To be honest, my first thought was, wow, $1.5 billion. Do we
Right.
really need to spend $1.5 billion on this?
Yeah.
Sorry, the emails keep chiming. I'm very popular. I
It's,
don't know
it's
if you're hearing it. Um, I am not enough to have turned those notifications off before the podcast. I'm curious, like, I'm not clear on, like, what is this museum? I'm wondering if, like, a lot of Star Wars fans are going to show up and be really annoyed that it's mostly not about Star Wars.
right. Yeah.
They'll probably have to have some Star Wars content just to appease those of us who are like, well, you got a helmet or anything there?
Can I get a stormtrooper?
I've been to Star Wars museum exhibits
Right.
in the
Right.
past and loved them.
Yeah.
So it sounds really cool. It sounds like it'll be fun, like a cool day at the museum, I suppose.
Yeah.
Sounds like George and I believe Melody Hobson is his wife, I
I
think.
think so too. Yeah.
Had a fun project on their hands. I'm curious to see what it really is.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess like when you sell Lucasfilm for $4.5 billion, and you're like, now I can finally do that $1.5 billion museum I've been having my eyes on
Yeah.
for all these years.
Leaves them with only $3 billion, though.
Right, I know. Got to be smart with that last $3 billion because that'll disappear on you. That'll disappear on you in a second. All right. Well, let's move on to our next story. And that is that the Star Wars franchise has a December release history with several films debuting during the holiday season, particularly between December 10th and December 20th. And these releases have capitalized on that festive period to attract fans and families, becoming a tradition for many, which we haven't seen since the release of The Rise of Skywalker. The trend began with Star Wars The Force Awakens, which was released on December 18th, 2015. I can't believe it's been that long. Directed by J.J. Abrams, this film marked the return of the saga after a decade-long hiatus. It reignited the series with new characters like Rey, Finn, and Kylo Ren, while reintroducing beloved icons such as Han Solo and Princess Leia. 2 years later, on December 15th, 2017, Rian Johnson's The Last Jedi followed. The film polarized audiences with its bold narrative choices, but earned praise for its exploration of the Force and unexpected character arcs. On December 20th, 2019, that's that 5 years ago tomorrow, The Rise of Skywalker debuted by J.J. Abrams, concluding the Skywalker saga. And while it aimed to tie together decades of storytelling, the film received mixed reviews, but was a box office success, solidifying the trilogy's impact. Additionally, the first standalone film, Rogue One, premiered on December 16th. Directed by Gareth Edwards, it told the story of the rebel mission to steal the Death Star plans, blending nostalgia with fresh perspectives. These December releases solidified Star Wars as a holiday season event, bringing generations together for epic storytelling. Did you? I started to feel like Star Wars was a December thing, even though to me as a kid, it was always May. It was always early summer. But the last couple of releases, or the last 4 releases coming in December, felt like it was a good fit. How did that strike you?
I mean, I'm old school. I miss the May kind of Memorial Day releases and summer blockbuster, but I'll take my Star Wars whenever I can get it. I believe Skeleton Crew was a December release. But I mean, was this a news story somewhere just to say that Star Wars movies have come out in December?
Yeah,
I
it's
know
I mean, it's
about
not
that.
really breaking news so much as
Yeah.
an observation, but it's interesting because I think Mandalorian and Grogu is scheduled to come out in May of 26. So
See, that feels more right to me, but that's just because
yeah,
I'm old and set in my ways. But I'll take Star Wars whenever.
yeah,
I think the more interesting question is like, what's going to be that balance between the shows and the movies? I'm sure
yeah,
I'm not the first person to bring this up, but by no means would I complain about all the Star Wars we've had because I'm a fan of most of it.
yeah,
Um, but has it kind of lowered the special event feeling of a new Star Wars movie?
yeah,
Because
yep,
even having like so many come out in that 5-year period, and I feel like I'm a fan of Solo, and I feel like Solo really suffered because it was just, oh, another Star Wars movie every 6 months.
yep,
There wasn't anything exciting about it. So
yep.
I'm curious to see how the movie is hyped and if there's a pause in new Disney Plus content.
Well, I think there's going to be, I think from what we understand, 2025 really only has Andor slated, season 2, which will be 12 episodes, and I think it starts in April, so it's going to take up a good chunk of the year, which is good. And yeah, I'm with you. I think, one of the things that I've been fortunate to go to a handful of they've done some of the television shows, they've done a 2-episode premiere in some of the theaters, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
seeing Star Wars in a theater, or going back to see Phantom Menace when it was re-released earlier this year, seeing Star Wars in a theater is a feeling that we've kind of forgotten because of the fact that we've gotten so much Disney Plus and Star Wars on television. And yeah, there's a real I'm a firm, when Mando first came out, I thought, okay, great, we can tell Star Wars stories on television, which was fine, and you can, but I'm with you. I want Star Wars back in the theater. I
It
think
was
it's
so
important.
special that way, and I really wanted to go see that Skeleton Crow is another great show. Skeleton
Uh,
Crew 2-hour premiere,
yeah,
but, uh and I wanted to bring my kids, and I had the tickets, but they scheduled it, and I'm gonna lodge this complaint with you, Pete, rather than Lucasfilm itself. It was Monday night
yeah,
after Thanksgiving week, and I'm like,
right,
"Could you have done this during the entire week that my children were
right,
not in school,
right,
as opposed to after school at night on Monday night when they have to go
right,
to school again on Tuesday?" It wasn't gonna happen.
right. Their first day back after a long
First day
weekend. It was
back,
just,
they're
yeah,
exhausted, and then they
yeah.
get in LA the whole week of Thanksgiving off,
Oh, nice.
which we didn't have when I was a kid in LA, but
Right,
so we could have gone anytime that week. I would have been, front and center, but,
right.
we were forced to watch it on Disney Plus like animals,
Oh my God.
like
I
animals.
I don't know how you coped with it.
I
I'm sure you're still dealing with the trauma, and
I'm
we're
not.
just we're
Luckily,
happy.
the show was good.
Well, we're happy you're here. So
Thank you, thank
well, let's hit our next story here. Speaking of television and Star Wars on TV, Lucasfilm has announced that Ahsoka season 2 will move production to the United Kingdom, marking a notable shift from the LA-based sets used for the first season. This change coincides with an unusual development. For the first time in over 6 years, no live-action Star Wars projects are currently in production at Lucasfilm's LA facilities. IndieWire broke the news, revealing that the second season will depart from the volume-heavy production techniques of its predecessor. Instead, a broader range of filming methods is expected, likely influencing the decision to relocate overseas. Currently, Ahsoka is the only live-action Star Wars Disney Plus series actively in pre-production. With no new series announced and several projects completed, this move might signal a strategic pause as Lucasfilm reevaluates its live-action pipeline, while sources indicate that more live-action series are in development. It remains unclear whether Lucasfilm will offset the reduced live-action content for Disney Plus by expanding its animated offerings, but meanwhile, fans can catch up on Ahsoka Season 1, which is streaming in full on Disney Plus, and there is no date yet for the second season. So let's talk about, first of all, Ahsoka. You and I haven't spoken since Ahsoka came and went. How did you
No,
feel about the series?
we've been totally keeping our feelings about Ahsoka
Right,
under
we haven't shared.
wraps.
We were waiting for this moment.
It hasn't felt right until now. I enjoyed Ahsoka. I don't think it's my favorite of the Star Wars series. I've pretty
Yeah.
much enjoyed them all. Maybe I'm very easy to please because
Hmm.
I love Star Wars. And, I watch them with my kids, and Ahsoka is my daughter's favorite character by
Hmm.
far.
Yep.
However, she's not as into grown-up Ahsoka as she
Mhm.
is into, teen Ahsoka.
Yeah.
But I thought it was a fun show. I'm
Yeah.
looking forward to season 2 and see what they do now that wonderful actor whose name is escaping me has passed away, and
Yeah.
we ended on a big cliffhanger that involved him. So
Yeah.
I guess they're just going to replace him with a different actor, and just we'll go with that.
Yeah. I guess they'll have to.
We
Yeah.
don't know though yet, do we?
We don't know. In fact, there's like
Ray,
very
Ray,
li what's that? Ray, what's that?
isn't it, the actor's name is
Yeah.
Ray something.
I have to look it up
Oh,
now.
you should know. You're in this world more than
I
me.
know, but
Okay, well, the audience, you don't have to look it up. They know. They know.
they
who I'm
know.
talking
They're
about.
listening. They get it. They
Oh,
understand.
they know more than we do. Um, he was great,
Yeah.
and the show is cool.
Yeah.
And I think if you were really into Rebels, which I wasn't,
Okay. Yeah,
I'm
that
no
was gonna be my
diss
next
on
question.
Rebels, but I still haven't seen all of Rebels. And I know you've told me that that's a big mistake. Um, so I think probably for fans of Rebels, it was like really exciting.
Well, it was, and I think that's the challenge, right? Because I leverage, I go back and I think about my father, who is in his 70s, and he's a Star Wars fan, and he watches all the live action, but he watches zero animation. And to him, it was he couldn't get as much into it. He liked the show, it had action, and it was, he knew Ahsoka from Mandalorian, but it wasn't that connective tissue for him. And for me, I thought it was great, but it was lacking a little bit of something. And I think part of it was the fact that it was all shot on the volume. So I think it felt a little bit
It'd feel
flat.
a
So
little, flat.
so I'm excited that they're taking it out to the UK to do some shooting on location, etc. Because I
With a
think that
lot of I hear that countdown music, but with that a lot of the shows, I do feel like they feel a little small
yeah.
sometimes.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I've noticed is that a lot of the shows, including Mandalorian, which I love,
Hmm.
it's like a lot of the locations, the exterior locations seem to be like a town is like one street.
Yeah. Yep.
And a lot of the action takes place on that one street.
Yep.
And I can kind of buy that for one or two places, but it feels like a lot of the places in the galaxy are very similar.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And that was my biggest complaint about Kenobi was it felt kind of flat, felt kind of small, for the same reasons. But you're right. I think that when they
rank them? What's your ranking?
well, okay. Mandalorian is first.
Okay.
I guess after that would be Andor, because I think Andor is just so well done.
Yes.
Third would be Ahsoka.
Okay.
Fourth would be Book of Boba Fett.
Mm.
I'm leaving Skeleton Crew out because I'm not, it's not, as of right now, I love it. It's going to be pretty high when it's done.
But you
And
think
then
the next few episodes might be awful, so you're reserving judgment.
they might, the bottom might fall out.
Okay.
And then fifth would be Acolyte, which would actually, that's, I took, yeah. I love the story, but the execution to me wasn't quite there. What about you? How do you rank them?
Well, you are clearly not a true fan because you didn't absolutely love all of them. No, I
They're
think
all number one.
Mando first, but Andor is also first in some
Mhm.
ways. It's just Mando is, you can never forget your first.
Right. Yep.
And Mando is so good, especially that first season.
Yep.
But it's all good. I like it all. But Andor was so good, especially that middle arc. So those two are like up on a really high tier for me. I might put I'm not afraid. I might put Skeleton Crew third at this point.
Yeah.
I'm really enjoying it. I think it's super fun and different. And then after that, I might go Acolyte. I think I like Acolyte a lot better than you. And I mean you as a person, I liked it so better than you.
I liked it better than you. If I had to choose between speaking to you or watching the Acolyte, I'm taking the acolyte.
I mean, I'm really disappointed that it ended on a cliffhanger
Yeah.
and that they canceled it. Like
Yeah.
I was but that's not the show's fault.
Right.
And after that, they kind of run into each other. Like I like Book of Boba Fett, but the Mando episodes were the best.
Yep.
And I also really liked that old plot with him and the Tusken Raiders. I thought
Yep.
that was really cool. And of course, I liked seeing Cammy and Fixer. We're going to talk about
Hmm.
nostalgia later. So
Yep.
that stuff always works for me.
Yep.
But so I think in the bottom slots, I might put Obi-Wan and then Boba Fett and then Ahsoka.
Okay. That's fair. That's
And
fair.
I enjoyed them all to
Yep.
varying degrees.
Well, it's interesting. So for me on Acolyte, I felt like it was bumpy. I felt like there was I felt like they didn't know how to take this great story and put it into. I think there's an art form that is still yet to be really mastered in telling limited series or streaming series stories, right? Like I felt like a lot of those episodes were just kind of like, oh, we have to stop here. We're at 39 minutes. Time to stop. Let's get to the next one. And whereas I think that's why it felt to me like executionally, it just was a little bit bumpy. But the story, I feel like of all the shows, maybe outside of Andor, it's the best story, top to bottom. I mean, it was a really
Really
cool
interesting and
tale.
different. I like seeing new basically I know that some of these characters are now known through books, but I like seeing a whole new group of characters in
Yeah,
this universe. I loved Soul.
yeah,
He was a great character. So overall, I just thought it was really, I thought the lightsaber battles were like really
yeah,
good,
yeah,
really epic. So I really enjoyed it.
yeah.
And it's funny because I was watching that with my kids and they still haven't watched the final episode.
Mm,
And not because I've haven't let them, that just kind of they haven't. Occasionally they mention when we're watching Skeleton Crew, they're like, oh, we still have to watch the end of the Acolyte. And I'm like,
right.
yeah, but it ends on a cliffhanger. It doesn't resolve. And also what
Yeah,
I didn't tell them is it's kind of a dark
yeah,
ending, and my kids are still pretty young. Like they're bored to tears by Andor. Love
yeah, right.
Skeleton Crew. They
Yep,
love Skeleton Crew.
yep,
They're like, Andor's bad. They only
yeah.
watched the first one.
The same thing. My son
They
got about
bailed
halfway
out
through the
before
first one.
yeah,
Yeah,
bailed out before it ended.
yep,
And I told them like it's really good, but maybe they would like it better in a few years, or maybe if they saw, later episodes.
yeah,
I think it's just that's more of like an adult, not like adult like sexy, but
right.
an adult geared, it's just grittier and more grounded, more realistic. There's not the force. It's
Yep,
really just like a really well done, really tight, gripping drama
yep,
that
yep,
you could watch as an adult who's never cared about Star Wars. And it's not really, it's enough Star Wars to be Star Wars, but
right.
I think the lack of Jedi and the Force, I'm sure that you've discussed this to death already,
Yeah,
kind of make it very different and
yeah.
more accessible to people who are kind of not as into the more fantastical elements of Star
But
Wars.
what I find really interesting, and I think this speaks maybe more to the maybe the style of the show, the pacing of the show, whatever. My son loves Rogue One. That's one of his favorite Star Wars movies. But there's very little Jedi stuff in that.
Mhm.
And it is more sort of war story, etc. So I think it is because Andor takes its time, right? I mean, when I think about, and that's one of the issues that I have with again most of the series is they're paced a lot like the animated shows in that there's like we have 24 minutes, we're going to get the story in and
Mhm.
and that's great. But you watch a show like Dune Prophecy or um House of the Dragon or something like that, and they let those stories happen over time. I don't feel like
Right. Like I
and,
would compare Andor more to like a Better Call Saul. If you
yeah,
watch that,
yep,
Breaking Bad, they really take their time and it's really tightly plotted
yep, yep,
and it's very rewarding if you're into that kind of thing. But I can
cor-
tell you that my children are not into that kind of thing. But
right,
that's what I love is they made it. They made it for not necessarily kids.
Correct.
And
Yep.
that's I love that they're doing different things, different styles. There can be young Jedi adventures, and there
Yep.
can be Andor, and everything
Exactly.
in between.
And everything in between. And the great thing is, and we need to remind people of this often, and that is you don't have to love all of it, right? I mean, it's not going to be for you for everybody. Everything's not going to be for there's like,
You know what we loved? What the kids and I loved, and I don't know why they shunted it off of Disney Plus and over to YouTube, was the show that Ahmed Best hosted, the
oh
Jedi Temple Challenge. Like,
yes.
kids loved that, and they were like, "We got to go on this." I'm like, I don't think it's coming back.
Yep.
Which
Yeah.
was so awesome when he turned up in the same character on Mando. But
Yes.
like, I would love to see more of that.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. It's different ways to enter the story, which is great. Well, cool. Well, we are going to take a real quick 60-second break, and when we come back, we're gonna dig more into what makes Star Wars and the nostalgia of it and the pros and cons of it. So we're gonna be right back in 1 minute with more ATG Live. Well, welcome back to ATG Live.
Mesmerizing.
I never know how people are going to react to the perhaps more produced than it needs to be Thursday Night Live stream.
I was like, oh, this is great. This is like a real show.
Yeah, well, we border on it. We flirt with it, but so welcome back to ATG Live, your Thursday night home for all things Star Wars. We do news, we do hot takes, we do conversations, and we have great guests like Scott Chernoff, who is with us tonight. And Scott was saying earlier how he was one of the hosts of the very early the 1, 2, and 4 Star Wars Celebration.
Yeah.
And of course,
not 3 though. I didn't want to be associated with that one.
3 was a mess. Nobody wanted. I like to think, Scott, they did 1 and 2 with you, and they were like, let's take a little break. And then after 3, they were like, how do we not do this with Scott? So
I think that's what happened. Then after 4, they went, oh, okay, now we know.
Oh, wait, yeah, that's right. That's
right. We don't need that guy anymore.
Well, before we get into this conversation, you had posted something the other day on social media that you have a book which is coming out not next year, but the year after, much like around the same time as Mandalorian and Grogu. I don't know about timing specifically, but
it probably will be because the publisher is like, well, we have to put it out around May the 4th, right? I'm like,
exactly.
Yeah, of course.
There you go. Sure. So tell us a little bit about what you got so far.
Oh boy. Well, Pete, when you apparently signed to do a book, you have to write it. So
that's
I got to
the hardest part.
that.
Yeah.
That part, good luck to me, because I think I still haven't learned how to, use verbs. Hoping I can master that. No, the book is called, at least for now, My Star Wars Years, and I'm gonna actually give a shout out to an old friend of mine named Fred Stoller, who I stole this idea from. He's an actor who you would definitely recognize if you look him up. You'd never recognize his name, but he's a character actor who's been in a billion things, and he was also a writer for 1 season of Seinfeld.
Okay.
And he wrote a book called My Seinfeld Year, about his year writing for Seinfeld, and I was like, wow, that's
Fred Stoller. I just brought him up here. I said, yeah, look him up.
Huh?
Yes,
look him up. You'll recognize his quirky face from many commercials and comedy sitcoms and stuff. Um, and he wrote this book called My Star Wars Year, and I thought, well, that's, I can do that. So I stole the idea from him.
There you
And
go.
I'm writing a book called My Star Wars Years, and it is about my years as a writer and then editor for Star Wars Insider. And I also wrote a little bit for Star Wars Galaxy, a little bit for StarWars.com. I did a book for Lucas Books way back in the day about episode 2, the scenes thing. And it's sort of and the celebrations, of course, which is the first one, is a chapter in and of itself, as I'm sure you've heard. But it's about how a fan, a nerd and a Star Wars fan with no connections at all, like kind of got to go behind the curtain and meet all the people who make Star Wars on and off camera and interview them and go on the set and all my wild untold stories. It's kind of like this is now a very old reference, I'm realizing, but it's kind of like an Almost Famous, if you remember that movie.
Yep.
Without the sex, drugs, or rock and roll.
Which that's most of the movie, Scott. That's
most of the movie. So maybe not the most edgy book.
Right.
But it's the same kind of concept. It's the fan who got to go behind the curtain and meet his heroes and see it all. And lots of stories in there that I'll tell, like how Ewan McGregor had me removed from the set and why. Or a heist that I pulled off and stole a little bit of Tatooine. Just a little bit.
Just a little bit.
A little bit of Tatooine that I took home. And a lot of other, how I crashed R2-D2. I was allowed to use to control him, and that did not go well. And just stories with Harrison Ford and Ewan McGregor, obviously, Sam Jackson, and a lot of the actors who were, like, to me, the stars of Star Wars. And those are your Lobots, your Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru, all of these so-called minor characters that were huge to me. And I made sure to meet and interview. One of my proudest moments, it's not a very exciting story, was reuniting Billy D. Williams and the actor John Hollis at one of the celebrations. I think Celebration 4, I had the Lando Lobot reunion.
Oh, nice.
And I'm fairly convinced that Billy D had no idea who Lobot was. Had no memory of Lobot whatsoever.
That's great. That's funny.
Yeah, and then I'll also talk about how I worked then as an actor, because in addition to Star Wars, I'm a comedy writer and performer. I do voices on Rick and Morty, and I've written for Conan and BoJack and blah blah blah. You can look it up. But I did a comedy thing on the Jimmy Kimmel Show, like a sketch with Billy D, and that's a really funny story. And the way he recognized me from Star Wars without actually recognizing me. It's a long story, but
that's great.
He thought he knew who I was. We'll put it that way.
That's awesome.
I let him believe that I was somebody else.
Well, I love it. I can't wait for the book to come out. I've heard some of the stories you've told talking with us, or at least pieces of them, and I can't wait to dig into it. And those are the fun stories, right? And I think that's one of the great things about and sort of why I've wanted, how I got into doing some of the writing and just some of the cool things that I got to do as a result. And those are the fun stories. Like, those are the stories people like. One of my favorite stories that people love to hear me talk about is when I got the chance to go to the ranch and Rick McCullum interrupted my tour and then apologized to me. There's more to the story to that than that, but just these sort of funny little things that, as here I am as as you said, like a fan who happens to be, how am I here situation, and it's always, I think
Rick
everybody loves that.
Will be making an appearance, a few appearances in the book. In fact, if it stays how I have it right now, which who knows, because I haven't really started. We're talking about, I wrote like a very long proposal and I wrote a few chapters, but I start with a story that involves Rick McCallum, and that is very much a how did I get here kind of a story. Like, what am I, because really, Pete, I got to be a part of all this tangentially, but I'm no better, no different than any of the fans. I was up there at Star Wars Celebration 1, and I was the one on stage talking to
Right.
the people, but there's functionally no other difference between me and the other people in the audience.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, see, and people can sense that as well. Like they get that you are enjoying that particular moment. And it's interesting now in the social media space and the podcasting space. And, there are people who are just quote unquote just fans that have this sort of different feel about them. To your point, to just always remember who you are. You're a fan who just happens to be getting to do some cool stuff. And that's much more interesting and much more engaging. So
And I know there's a lot of negativity out there that you've, I'm sure, talked about quite a bit, and I'll just get in my one statement that Star Wars is truly for everyone. And if
yeah,
somebody tells you that you're not a true fan, they are not a true fan.
this is true. Yep, 100%. And I talk about that a lot. In fact, I just went through a whole conversation online with somebody about the Last Jedi, and just you may not like that movie, and that's totally cool. But for somebody else, it's their favorite. Like for me, putting that there, Rise of Skywalker, my least favorite Star Wars movie, bottom of the barrel, bottom. But I also know that there's many Star Wars fans that just that's their absolute favorite, and I don't. That's great because that means that they got into Star Wars somehow, and just welcome to the club, right? Let's all love this thing.
Listen, Rise of Skywalker is not one of my favorites, but it's got Lando.
This
Okay.
is true.
So as far as I'm concerned, all is forgiven.
You've
When they brought back Lando, I'm a huge Lando fan, and I was
Yeah.
like, okay, finally, before it ends, we're getting Lando.
Exactly. And you know what? It's funny.
I'm in.
I
I'm
used to when I used to do the 10 question segment of my Star Wars podcast, which we don't do as much anymore. But when one of the questions I used to ask people was, "Who's your favorite? If you could be any Star Wars character, who would
Oh.
you be and why?" And somebody said Lando because he's survived it all.
Mhm.
It's kind of true. He's the only one of the major characters that made it through.
That's true. Well, I mean, and that leads into, I know that you had topics to get to that I've completely hijacked, but I think
You know what? I'd
talk
rather just let it roll. So
nostalgia.
let's talk about that.
And that is, like, for me, a powerful factor when Lando's there. When Nine Nunn is there, I'm like, I'm in. Is
Right.
it Nyan or Nian? I still don't know
I
after
would
all
say
these
Nian, but I hear most people say Nyan,
I used
and I
to
just
say Nian, and then at some point I switched to Nyan. I don't know.
so, but why is it, do you think, that nostalgia plays such an important role in Star Wars fandom? And is it a dangerous thing at times?
No, it's not dangerous
It's
at all. I
never
mean,
dangerous.
I think it's only a plus, and when done well and when done right. And I'll
Yep.
talk about that in a second. But I think, to answer your question, like, nostalgia is a powerful force in everything in
Right.
life. We all get older. I notice that your beard is gray.
Yeah, it's white. It's
And white, gray, exactly. I've got some of that in what hair that I have left.
yes.
And, but whether it's Star Wars or anything else, I mean, the stuff that we loved when we were kids will
Mhm.
always be powerful. And Star Wars was, so all encompassing for me as a kid. When I see those characters, when I see those elements pop up in the new ones, it just strengthens that connection.
Yeah.
But in terms of being done well, if I'm going to get on my high horse, for instance, the nostalgia and Skeleton Crew is done very well
Yes.
because it's not, there's no attention called to it.
Yeah.
If you know, you know.
Yep.
And you're like, whoa, that is the same kind of creature who was in the battle for Endor.
Yes.
And that's hilarious and amazing. But
Yep.
you don't have to know that. I
Right.
watched Skeleton Crew with my kids, and like, they have no idea that they like Ewoks, but I've never subjected them to the Ewok movies because I know they'll be bored to tears.
Right.
And they're not enough into Star Wars to be, super completists like that.
Right.
But like, but I knew, and I was
Right.
totally delighted, but it didn't take away from the story. I don't know if it added to the story. I mean, there was a creature that ferried them from one place to the other. And so,
Yep.
like, I've read that, and I didn't even notice that the Star Tours ship is in,
Yeah.
um,
It's in the background at the
yeah,
at Port
and like,
Gorgo. Yep.
or the Captain EO character, which isn't even Star Wars, is visible. And those are just like fun touches that are fun if you notice them. I
Right.
think you got to be a little careful to not like do it so much that, or to the extent that you're taking somebody out of the
Yep.
story, I guess. But that hasn't happened with me yet. And I know that that's why I was saying that Rebels fans would love the Ahsoka series more than those of us who, I've seen Rebels, but I was never into Rebels. And so
Right.
that Rebels is now old enough, I'm guessing, when did it end? At
Uh,
least
5 years
10
ago?
years? No.
Yeah.
5 years ago.
Now I'm gonna look that up now. Yeah.
2018, there was new episodes of Rebels, you're telling me? Maybe there was. Maybe you're right.
I
I
have to
guess
look it
it
up.
was on in the mid.
March 5th, 2018 was the final episode.
Okay,
Yeah.
so it's not
So
that
yes.
old. Okay,
Yeah.
so but I'm imagining there's nostalgia involved.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, and it's the ones that bring you in. Like I talk a lot about how my 12-year-old son, like his Star Wars is Clone Wars.
Right.
So his entree into Star Wars was the animated series. His Han, Luke, and Leia are Rex, Fives, and Cody, right? Those are his guys. And there's a lot of people who, for them, that's Rebels. And I think that might have been one of the issues, honestly, with Ahsoka, is that it was a story that was still a little recent. And that so now if you were to come back and tell me, I don't know, Sebulba's story, I don't know, just pulling that out of it.
I would love to see
That
Sebulba's
would be
story.
like that I would be so into because I would, whatever happened, did did he go on to race again or whatever? But I think that there's the yes, it almost that leads more to there's a difference between nostalgic and being self-referential,
Well,
right?
there's also it's also like, why wasn't it a Rebels series?
Right.
If you want to critique anything, and why did Book of Boba Fett have 2 episodes that were basically episodes of The Mandalorian?
Yep.
Like, that's a little weird.
Yep.
I loved those episodes,
Sure.
so it's not really a complaint, but it's a little off.
Yep. Yep. For sure. And I totally agree. And I think that's the weird thing. And so there's the recency, but there's also the old stuff. And does it ever feel like they're leaning too much into that? I know we talked about how, nostalgia is not it maybe a better way to put it is an example of it being done really well is the teak flying the little
Mhm.
ferry back and forth. In Rogue One, Rogue One, when Dr. Evazan is on the streets, that
Mm,
felt a little like, hey, look, it's that guy from the
mm.
cantina. Remember him? So,
And what really worked for me with the nostalgia in Rogue One was just going, "Oh, we're at Yavin Base.
yeah, yep,
Oh, look at the hallways on the, Death Star," or
yep,
whatever it was, like, that kind of visceral feeling of, "Oh, we're back in that world,"
yep,
and I think that, if anything, I feel like the way it's been overdone, and I would put this a little bit on Force Awakens and a lot on Rise of Skywalker, is more in kind of repeating the same basic stories.
yes, hmm,
And, it kind of worked with Force Awakens because it had been so long, and it was
yep,
like structured very much like something we knew, and it was very nostalgic movie while also feeling new.
hmm,
And for me, it worked.
yep,
And
yep,
then by the time we got to Rise, but then we had Last Jedi, which I really like, and which really made an effort to break out of that and to
yep,
keep it a Star Wars story, but take it in surprising different directions.
yes,
But a lot of people didn't like that. They were like, "Oh, why is it going in that direction?"
right,
And I liked it. And so I think there was an overcorrection with Rise of Skywalker, and I'm sure I'm not the first person to say this,
yep,
where it was too much like, again, like, okay, now we're going to do it again. And like, we've seen this, we've seen, say what you will about episodes 1, 2, and 3, and there are, I believe, some narrative, issues we could talk about in those, but they were very different
yeah, yep,
in from each other and from the original trilogy.
Right.
They had that feeling, they were in that world, and like that's the best kind of nostalgia, is having that feeling and being in that world. But
Yeah.
that to me was the biggest problem with Rise of Skywalker, was it didn't feel confident enough to go in those new directions that Last Jedi did. Like it almost felt like
Yeah.
we were shrinking back down.
Yeah.
And okay, my Rey is related to Palpatine. Like it's let's keep it all, let's get it all back under control into this world that we're familiar with.
Yeah. Yep. No, and I think the other challenge too is doing it in such a way that feels like it's doing it just to do it, right? Like and like I don't know, or doing it and not closing the loop. Like for example, one of my biggest challenges, I mean, Book of Boba Fett had a bunch of issues, a fun show, great opportunities, loved seeing things like loved seeing Chrysanthemum from the comic books, which I don't really read the comic books, but I knew who that character was. I thought it was really well done.
Anytime there's a Wookiee anything, that was one of the things I loved about the Acolyte. I was like, there's a Wookiee Jedi, I'm in.
Yep, and Solo, you had the Wookiee slaves, and just this really cool. And again, that's a great way to do it, right? You bring in a character, you're like, oh, I know what that is. That's in that weird world that I love. But then you had, like, for example, the Hutts that showed up, which was great, but then they didn't do anything with it. It was more like, to me, it kind of struck me as, hey, remember these kind of guys? And then that was it.
And what about though in Skeleton Crew, where we've got that Wolfman type creature? I don't know that species name, but from the cantina, like
yes. Yeah, which again, it was in the cantina, and it's now it's playing a role, and he's obviously, I mean, I'm sure he's going to be back in it. I'm sure he's not giving up the pursuit on Jod. But I think the other thing that's kind of cool about Skeleton Crew, and one of the great things about Skeleton Crew to me, is it's nostalgic in the way it's telling the story versus just filling it up with all kinds of Star Wars stuff. I mean, that's all in there. I mean, that entire
for the 80s.
Yeah.
For 80s Spielberg, Amblin type movies, Goonies and E.T. and even Poltergeist, all the movies about kids that were living in suburbia.
Yes. In fact, it's funny you say Poltergeist, because a lot of people have not referenced that, and I have referenced it. That neighborhood to me is the Poltergeist neighborhood. 100%.
I've been in that neighborhood. It's not far from where I live.
Oh, really?
Yes, I went to a holiday party a few years ago, and they were like, it wasn't the Poltergeist house, but it was like, or was it? It was like next door to the Poltergeist. And now I can't remember. But I was like, oh my god, are there like Native Americans?
Right. I just hope
underneath this house,
Wim doesn't get a pool installed and it all goes to hell.
Yeah. But that movie had the same. It was that same Spielberg feel, and so interestingly, Skeleton Crew kind of leaned into that as well. And I like that anytime that we're getting other influences in, and it's kind of expanding. But I'm a Star Wars sucker. Like I love, like in Obi-Wan, when they meet, like at some point we meet a homeless former clone trooper.
Yep.
Played by Tamara Morrison. And like, it's always just cool. I love, like, one of the things I love, and this is a nostalgia thing, and I don't know why I love it. I love when one era of Star Wars stories intersects with another.
Yes.
So when, like, one of the more recent things is referencing something from episode 1 or 2, or, know, like, it's always just super fun. Like, oh, this is like set in, this is Last Jedi, but it's referencing, God knows what.
And it's interesting too, because I think it was one of the critiques, if I remember correctly, about the sequels, was that it was too many new aliens. You didn't see any of the old aliens that you knew, which is kind of true. Like there was not a Rhodian in sight. There was not a there were no Wookiees, but Skeleton Crew, the latest episode, there's Eopies from the Phantom Menace, which was so cool to see, and again, just subtle enough for. And the key point there too is that you don't have to be a Star Wars. You don't have to know what Eopies are to get it to work in the story. right? And I think that was the problem with Mando season 3 was I think you had to kind of start to understand the Mandalorian lore a little bit. You had to almost be a student of Star Wars. Whereas when Ahsoka, I mentioned it before, when I always reference my dad, and when Ahsoka showed up in the Mandalorian season 2, I was like, "Do you know who that is?" And he said, "She's some cool Jedi character." And I was like, "You have no idea how cool she is. She was the apprentice of Luke and blah, blah, blah." But it was cool because it
You didn't
worked
need
really
to.
well, right? He didn't need to know the full story. Where starting to dig into some of that lore of Mandalore, it's cool for me who loves the Clone Wars. Took me a number of years to watch it. I have to admit that I was not into it at
Yeah,
first, but
I didn't watch it until my daughter wanted to watch it, and then we
yeah,
watched the whole series.
yeah. And now it's like I can't believe I missed it when it happened. I was so excited about it. But if you didn't watch that, some of the season 3 Mando stuff might be lost on you. I don't know for sure, but
Well, what
um,
was great about Mando in season 1 is the episodic nature of it.
yes,
How it
yeah,
I loved, and I loved when they brought Luke in, and that was really exciting, but, like,
yep,
the fact that it was a different story with different characters, and it wasn't so reliant on the Force, and I love the Force, but,
yeah,
I just love that it was different,
yeah,
and the stories were kind of self-contained, so when it got brought into the larger story, it gained something and it kinda lost something.
yeah, yeah. And I think that's probably why Skeleton Crew is working so far. Is that it's not it's good to it's funny on the one hand I remember saying things like it needs to have galactic consequences, but it doesn't. It's
It does.
Mando, and that's the challenge that Mando is facing now, is it's getting into this bigger sort of New Republic story. We got to make
Right.
sure that we keep that thing that we loved about Mando being sort of the lone wolf and cub story. It didn't matter the happenings around them as much. So
Right, and having Grogu there was, like, just enough of the Force and Jedi,
yeah,
it was so perfect,
yeah,
but, yeah, I mean, look, it's all good.
yeah,
It's just, we're
yeah,
nitpicking it a bit, but it is, I think, what's so great about the Star Wars universe, one of many things that's great about it, is it's so vast that you can tell all these different
right.
stories, and that's why Skeleton Crew is so fun, is that it's a different story.
Hmm.
Doesn't have to have galactic consequences. It might, but, we're learning a lot more about the old republic, the new republic, and, these hidden planets and all that stuff.
Hmm.
Like, we're learning that, and that's kind of cool.
Yep.
So there's elements from other Star Wars that we've seen and are used to, but it is its own story and it's a different style and it's this kind of pirate thing. And it's awesome that this universe is so vast that we can have that. We can have this kind of mystery type show of the Acolyte. We can have this
Yep.
gritty political spy thriller in Andor, and gosh knows what else. Like, I know they're
Right.
not going to do like comedy, but they could.
Yeah.
They could
They
bring it,
could. And maybe they should.
or
I mean,
I don't know
yeah.
if they should. And I'm a
Rom-com.
comedy guy, but I don't know if they should. I'm not saying they shouldn't, but I'm not sure. And that show that Paul Scheer talked about
Yeah.
sounded so good, and he is so fun. I mean, he's so good. He's
Yeah.
just like a way better guest than me. He
No,
is super funny, super talented, and that show sounded super good. And
yeah.
at the same time, I was like, yeah, I'm not surprised that they didn't. More surprised that it got as far as it did.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they weren't going to let it out there. But but they let it happen, as he pointed out with the Lego
Yeah.
stuff. And
And it
that's
it's
just different enough that in animation they feel safer.
it's funny that they let so much. I mean, if you watch the Lego shows, they're almost like the Emperor version of Lego is so close to the Family Guy version of the Emperor. It's
Yeah,
actually kind of funny to me that they let it get that close, and they just it's. But again, it's a completely different format, and I think a good way to kind of bring this around is what is it doing to bring in new audiences, because we're going to be there. We're there till the end, and I think that's one of the interesting things about the marketing of Star Wars now is if it says Star Wars on it, we're going to watch it. The grifters who hate it, allegedly hate Star Wars, they're going to watch it too. But how do they bring in that next audience? And
And it's not by nostalgia. It's by growing and expanding. It's new characters, new creative people behind the scenes, different perspectives,
mhm,
new stories, awesome new characters. And, as long as it's in that Star Wars universe, it's going to have the nostalgia that we want. And it can be done
right,
the way Skeleton Crew does it if they want. We can throw in things for us old fogies,
yep,
but it can't just be Luke and Leia and Han, as much as that pains me to say. Like, it's just
right. Yeah, I think about the well, the sort of butthurt sort of postings that I've seen of the Photoshop pictures of Luke, Han, Leia, and Lando and the Falcon all in their senior years, and people saying this was what they robbed us of. I don't know that I mean, it might have been fun to see, but I don't know that it would have been a great story. I mean, I understand why people want
there
it.
could have been a great story. There could be great stories with them that could have been executed well, but I think the best thing was bringing in new blood to keep
Right,
it alive and keep it relevant. And sadly, like, I think way back in the original, when the original trilogy was out, I really remember whether it was George talking about it or somehow it was in the air that, like, well, I'll make 1, 2, and 3. Eventually, that'll be, the prequels. But then, maybe we'll do 7, 8, and 9. And by then, Luke Skywalker will be a bit like Obi-Wan Kenobi
right,
in the original. And that always made sense to me. Like, in the later ones, like, these guys are going to be the old people, the mentors.
yep,
And, it can't always just be about senior citizens, as much as I know I will be one day, but it can't, it's got to stay relevant for
yeah,
kids. And like, and the idea that, like, oh, Luke should, we're not going to get into the Last Jedi discourse, but
right,
everything made sense to me. I didn't understand why some people were upset
yeah,
that Luke was, a hermit later in life. I'm like, well, isn't that what Yoda was? Isn't that what Obi-Wan was? I
yeah,
mean, if anything, that's staying true to the originals, in my
right,
opinion.
yep. No, and it's interesting too because even I show A New Hope to my 12-year-old son, and it's boring. It's like
Mhm.
Andor to him. It's just not cut the same. It's not as high paced. It's a very different way of taking in a story. So what's great is, I think about like when I was a kid and I would learn about, my dad would introduce me to Godzilla movies or the Universal horror movies, right? Because they were on TV on a Saturday or whatever, and I would watch them, and then he'd be like, "By the way, there's another Godzilla movie," and I would be like, "What?" Or
Yeah.
and here's the Bride of Frank. What? And so to
There's
know
more.
that world can open, and like for my
Yeah.
son again, who starts with I may have told you this before, but this is you know, it was great because you and I had the "I am your father" moment. We saw that in the theaters or whatever, we experienced
Spent
that.
3 years wondering if Darth Vader was telling the truth.
Correct, right, and
3 years.
that was
I was
our big.
convinced he was lying.
Yeah, I was too. I thought for
I
sure,
was like, "Don't fall for it, Luke."
he's just trying to get you. But my daughter, before we watched Rise of Skywalker, we watched the previous 8, and she hadn't really watched much of the prequels, and when she found out that Palpatine was, uh was Sidious, she was like, "I knew there was something wrong with that guy." So I was like, I never saw that as a, as an
Right,
aha
as a
moment,
mystery.
but,
And did you watch with her 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, or did you do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6?
she had seen 4, 5, and 6 before, and then we sort of started again from the top.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Because
actually
I
have on
started
video.
with Phantom Menace, much like your guest Paul Scheer, and, like, I never thought I would, but I
Yes.
just knew that at that age and the year that we were, like, maybe if I had kids when I was really young,
Yeah.
we would have started with episode 4, but, like, I just knew that Phantom Menace was going to grab her way more than A New Hope would.
And it's funny because, back then, I mean, you and I have talked about this a number of times based on just because you were there at Celebration 1 and the response to Phantom Menace, and now you watch it with your kids and you realize that that movie freaking worked. Like it hit what it was supposed to do. Because my son of the prequels, that's probably his favorite, and it
Yeah,
just
and we went and saw it on re-release a couple years ago,
yep,
and as well as Return of the Jedi last year in the theaters, with the
yep.
kids, they loved them both.
Yep, they love the Ewoks. They love, they love all the stuff that people said was too childish. And
And
George,
when we saw Return of the Jedi, by the way, we brought a friend of, my daughter's who had never seen a Star Wars movie,
okay,
and we brought her to see Return of the Jedi with us, and she was like, "That's the greatest movie I've ever seen."
that's
I was
awesome.
like, "That was amazing."
And then you took them home and made them watch the Andor film. So
Yeah.
they said, "Dad, we're never
But
watching
yeah,
this
I mean,
movie."
people were resentful about the Ewoks. I wasn't. I was
Yeah.
just young enough to appreciate them. Even I saw all three of the originals in the theater. I was 5, 8, and 11.
Hmm.
So when people were like, "Oh, the Ewoks are just like the Muppets," I was like, "Yeah, they are.
They're
Muppets are
freaking
awesome."
awesome.
But then with the Jar Jar and all that. But he was right. These are for that part of it is for kids.
Yep, for
And I
sure.
think the Ewoks are, I mean, we've talked about the Ewoks ad nauseum, and I think they're badass. I mean, those little Muppets took down the Empire. I mean,
Exactly.
they were like crushing ATSTs with logs. I mean, that
Yeah.
is,
There's so much greatness about that whole concept. And but again, and then so if you want to get like it's that reflection of the Vietnam War, which God forbid we talk about the politics of Star Wars, which we won't today because we're having fun. But that's that's what it was. And it was, but again, it was just so well done in a way that brings you in. And ultimately I think that's the best thing about the Star Wars and the Disney era. And I'll close by asking you what your favorite thing about the new era of Star Wars is. But my favorite thing is the fact that there are so many doors now that people can come into. Again, my son came in through Clone Wars. We have our friend Greg Iwinski is a a writer who has done some work on the Young Jedi Adventures, and there's literally stuff for 4-year-olds. And then you have Andor. So like my wife, who's never really gotten into Star Wars, actually didn't hate Andor and kind of got into it, and it pulled her in because it was like, this is an interesting story. So
yeah.
that's my favorite thing about where Star Wars is today.
I think my favorite thing is just that Star Wars is today.
Mm,
I mean, I remember those years that I referred to earlier as the dark years,
right.
sort of the mid 80s through the mid 90s, when Star Wars was completely off the cultural radar.
Yeah.
It
Yep.
was just nowhere and nobody cared about it. Not nobody, but
Yeah.
the majority of the public wasn't caring about Star Wars anymore. It was passe.
Right.
And so the fact that it's being made and nurtured to the degree that it is, and we can have quibbles with all these different aspects, and we can question whether having so many TV series are taking away from the specialness of the movies, but it's also pretty damn special to be able to watch a new episode of Star Wars every week.
Right. Right.
And so I love that it's happening, and I think that for the most part it's at a very high level of
Yes.
quality. It hasn't been cheaped out on, and you may not like everything, and it'll never be George Lucas again. So in a way, I
Right.
look at everything as fan fiction.
Right.
Wouldn't it be fun if this happened? Wouldn't it be fun if we got to explore this corner of the Star Wars
Hmm.
universe?
Yep.
And so we're just having fun with it. I mean, I can talk about what my favorite shows or characters are, but my favorite thing is that it's happening, and I
Yeah.
have kids, and we get to go to Disneyland and ride the rides, and we get to watch the shows and
Mm,
talk about it.
yeah.
So I say it's all good.
Yeah. Yep. I agree with him on that 100% as well. Just the
And
fact
I
that,
mentioned the Muppets. I'm a huge sorry to interrupt, a huge
yeah.
Muppets fan. Disney also bought the Muppets. They haven't done much with the Muppets, and it's been
No.
very disappointing. And so the Muppets are largely irrelevant now
Yeah.
to today's younger people,
Yeah.
and that is heartbreaking to me. But they haven't done that with Star Wars.
Yeah. Oh man, they had the chance with that first Muppets movie that they came out with, which was so good. Me and
Loved
my kids
it.
watched it a billion times, and then they
Loved
kind of
And
let
the
it fall.
next one was good too, but it
Yeah.
wasn't incredible, but they've just kind of petered out. They had a ABC series that in my opinion was kind of misguided conceptually. Well done for what it was, but just they haven't really known what to do with the Muppets. And
somebody will come in
I
and
know the
figure it out.
Muppets because I love the Muppets, and they still, but still they like the more recent stuff. And when I say more recent, it's now like 20 years old with Christmas Carol and Treasure Island, and like I have. To me, Muppet Treasure Island is like the weakest of all the Muppet movies. If you ask my kids, it's hands down the best Muppet movie ever made. and I've watched it a dozen times with them. So
now I'm gonna have to pull that one out and watch that one again. It's been a while for me on Treasure Island, but
Muppets from Space is better, I think, of that era.
Well, Disney, if you're listening, and I know you are, because since I'm a shill, they have to monitor everything I do. Give Scott Chernoff a Muppet show. Let's see that. That'd be great. I say go back, like just bring the Muppet Show type of show back. Like just do it that way, because that worked.
But again, Jim Henson is gone.
Yeah, right.
It'll never be the same. But what about animated? Since then, what if we combine them? What if we take the Muppet Star Wars and make it an animated series?
I'm in. I'm there.
All right.
All right. Good. Well, so they got an audience of at least one. Yeah. I think that's enough. I mean, what else do they need?
I mean, we've got Darth Nader from the Muppet Show episode with Luke Skywalker.
Right. With Miss Piggy. And
all kind of spin out from there.
It writes itself, Scott. It writes itself.
It writes itself. I'm obsolete. Just get some AI and
it's right.
Go for it.
Oh no! So Scott, tell people where they can follow you one more time and keep up with you and be on the lookout for that book.
Chernoff, my name is written there on the screen. I'm on Twitter, but I rarely post there anymore because it's gone very downhill.
It is a mess.
I'm on Blue Sky, and maybe I'll probably be posting more as we approach the book release and I try to hype it. But if you want to hear me talk about Star Wars or the Muppets or Survivor, which is completely unrelated, and I'm also
didn't see that coming.
No, I know. Sometimes you hear what people are also a fan of, and you're like, oh, maybe we shouldn't be watching Survivor or Twin Peaks. Those are all my obsessions, my varied pop culture obsessions.
Oh, that's cool, though.
And no longer talking much about politics. Although I will say, and we didn't want to talk about it tonight, how prescient was the prequel trilogy when it comes to our political scene these days.
It is frighteningly prophetic. It is, yes. It's just
George Lucas kind of knew what he was doing. He was maybe just a little ahead of his time there. I think that there's so many people today who I've seen on the internet really don't believe that the prequels were hated by Star Wars fans when they first came out.
Yep. I mean, they were literally the books and documentaries created about George Lucas ruining their childhood.
Yeah.
We just, it's just proof that, it's like when people are like, when they watch the sequels and they say, well, how could people have forgotten all about the Jedi? Well, I mean, it's only been 20 years since the prequels and we've already rewritten that history. Never mind real important world history, which is being forgotten. But well,
luckily we've got you here keeping the flame burning.
That's what I'll do. That's what I will do. And I'll be on the lookout for that book. Make sure to follow Scott. Keep up with him on Blue Sky.
Thank you.
And he shows up on the show every now and again. I'll reach out to him. And he hasn't said no yet, which is either a reflection on how wonderful I am or how desperate Scott
more the latter. Somebody wants to talk to me? Okay.
Oh man. Well, this was a lot of fun as usual, my friend, and we will speak.
Thank you, sir. My best to Nick. I hope that he recovers from that horrible puking spell that he must be experiencing.
I'm sure it's something not
no
fun.
Other excuse.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us and following along for the evening. This has been a blast. Make sure to like, subscribe, share, all that stuff you're supposed to do. And we will see you next time on ATGLive.
Happy Life Day.
Just one more round, friend, then homeward bound, friend. Don't forget me in your dreams. Just one more song, friend, and then so long, friend. The nights get shorter, it seems. Just one more rhyme, friend. Yes, it's a crime, friend. But you know time, friend. Time can fly. So it's good night, friend. Good night, but not goodbye.
Wow.